Okay, well, hello everyone. We have a great episode for you today. My guest and I actually have quite a bit in common, believe it or not. And he himself has also been a therapist for 25 years. My guest is Jerry Hyde, and he is the author of the book that we're also going to talk about, Empathy for the Devil. It's split up into three parts, which I loved. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Jerry and I also have affinity for cemeteries. We love cemeteries. We love music, and among other things that you'll come to learn and find out in this podcast. So let me tell you a little bit more about him. Jerry Hyde was educated at Bryanston School in Dorset and went to art school at Kingston before working in film, theater, TV, and the music business. In his late 20s, he sought help for drug dependency and subsequently retrained as a psychotherapist. He followed a fairly conventional career throughout his 30s before completely losing the plot in his early 40s, and he's now in his 50s, and rebranding himself in the somewhat out there style for which he's become known, which some have dubbed Gonzo Therapy. He's also known to be the most dangerous therapist in the world, so you'll come to learn about that as well. And despite all attempts at midlife self-destruction, he still has a very live and thriving practice. During his career, he's worked with many well-known names in the arts and creative fields, plus his own background in the music, film, and TV business has formed his outlook and writing style. So, Jerry, welcome to the Path 11 podcast.
Thank you. And congratulations on pronouncing Bryanston correctly. Most particularly Americans, they stumble over that one. I don't blame them. A lot of our place names aren't that easy. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, before we kind of came on, I was asking you how to pronounce a couple of other things that we're going to talk about. But one of the things that I found really interesting as I started to read your book is that you said that this book really broke and changed you profoundly. So the book is called Empathy for the Devil. And you broke it up into these three sections of sex, drugs, rock and roll. And you were really vulnerable. I mean, you shared a lot of stuff of your personal experience and things that you went through. And I really appreciated the vulnerability and the honesty of it. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about how the book broke you and how it changed you profoundly and what this process was like for you.
I think if I was going to be specific, the work around my own sexual abuse and owning that, and I think I'd kind of wondered for many decades, probably, why do I feel that I was going to say good at, that's a strange way of describing it, but why did I feel I had such an affinity with clients of mine who'd been sexually abused, and why I had so many. I think we attract the clients we need. And yeah, I just had a kind of ability to work in that field and hadn't really, like a great many people who've been sexually abused, hadn't really acknowledged the full impact of those earlier experiences on myself and my life story. And a great many people who've been abused have to go through the confusion because that often comes with it, because it's usually not, for a lot of people anyway, a lot of guys, a lot of women have been violently sexually assaulted. Most of the men that I work with, and myself included, have been seduced. We haven't been violently attacked or dragged into a bush or something. It's not what happens to men in the same way as it often happens to women. So there can be a confusion there with, well, was this really, an abusive experience? Because there was some pleasure, or I benefited from it, or it wasn't that bad, all the kind of minimizing techniques that we're so good at. So I think really exploring the darker side of some of my earlier childhood experiences, and then taking it to the next level, which was probably the scariest, which was looking at this theory that people who have been abused become abusers, and going, okay, have I got the balls to really ask that question myself? Because there can't be an abuser alive that really admits it. I always find it interesting that the Nazis had on their belt buckles in the war, "God is with us," and no one ever thinks they're the bad guys, right? The journalist John Pilger said, I think I quoted him in an earlier book, "Have you ever thought maybe we're not the good guys?" And that's like, oh shit, yeah, we all want to be on the good side, but what if we're not? So I had to really dig into the darker side of my sexuality, which I think is what we all need to do, especially men at the moment, if we want to be safe, if we want to be in charge, if we want to really know ourselves. And that was a scary journey. You know, it's like, what am I going to find in this labyrinth?
Mm.
And I think I came out with some awareness that my boundaries are pretty short sometimes, or have been in the past, that I've been selfish, been unthinking, I've been insensitive. But no, it didn't turn me into a pedophile.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to go there. I had to, you know, I mean, there was never any risk. I know I don't feel attracted to children, but it was still scary terrain to enter into. And I think that changed me. And you know, that's, like I say, I think that's the work we need to be willing to do in that model of the shadow, is really go into those dark corners. And when you shine a light in there, it's like when you hear a noise in the dark and you switch the light on, it's very rare that it's actually a monster, it's a mouse, right? But you got to switch the light on and have a look.
Right. When the light goes on, it has nowhere to hide, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and I think it's important too that we're having this conversation. You know, one of the first bits of work that I did in the counseling field was with survivors of sexual assault. I was a rape crisis counselor for about 5 or 6 years. And, you know, one of the things that they would always say in the training is that, you know, it's 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men, but probably closer to also 1 in 3 men, but men are less likely to disclose and to report it. And, you know, you kind of touched upon that too in your book, because your perpetrator, you know, Better, was an older female, you know, and that sometimes that can bring a lot of confusion, or it's downplayed, like, oh, come on, man, why wouldn't you want that? You know,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like men sometimes aren't afforded the same, I don't know if rules is the right word, but like you said, it's kind of like, well, maybe that should be wanted by you, you know,
Yeah.
because you were young and there was this woman that was doing this and providing, you know, these sexual acts on you. But in fact, you know, it's like, no, it's still the same. It's a violation of the boundaries. It's, you know, it is sexual abuse, but men tend to stuff it and not explore it. And, you know, we might get into this a little bit more when we talk more about the tribe mentality and what it feels like to be a part of the tribe. And, you know, Sebastian Younger reviewed your book as well. I'm familiar with his work. But do you want to talk a little bit about that, just for men, and maybe some of the male listeners who might be listening on our podcast who have really been quiet about maybe their own sexual abuse that they've gone through and really don't know how to put a voice to it, or have been afraid to look at that shadow side?
Yeah, I mean, like I started with, I was just thinking back, I've not met a man who's been violently assaulted, although I think there's violence towards sexual transgression, but not in that kind of brutal, physical, overpowering way that a lot of the women I've worked with have. And therefore that confusion, I mean, I was told very explicitly by, I was 17, I just turned 17, and it was a friend of mine's mother who was in her mid-40s. I was told very explicitly by her, this is every young man's dream. And she was a grown-up. And I'd been trained to believe in grown-ups and trust grown-ups. So, but yeah, so I believed that. And it took me until I was in my 50s, I think. And it wasn't until I talked to a older therapist and I described this experience, which I'd talked about in therapy before and been told, well, yeah, that's not really an abuse, is it? But I talked about it with a male therapist, and he was like, well, that's rape. I was like, well, no, it's not rape. I mean, it can't be rape, right? Because I was, you know, and he went, okay, so what if you flip the gender? So you've got a 17-year-old girl who's shaking with fear and saying no, specifically saying, I know I don't want this. And a 45-year-old man climbs on top of her and has sex with her regardless. What's that? And I was like, well, that's rape. And he's like, well, why is it any different? And I think to have these kind of paradigm shifts in our heads is necessary, because there's physiology involved, right? You a lot of guys will say, but I got an erection, so I must have wanted it. Well, you will also encounter women who said, yeah, I became wet when I was assaulted, because your body is designed with certain nerve endings to respond to certain touch and certain stimulus. So yeah, I was terrified. I was shaking from head to toe. It's like every nerve in my body went into spasm, but I was still physically able to have penetrative sex.
Mhm.
And then it became repeated. I mean, it went on for weeks because there was a kind of power. I think one of the things that I explored is if you go beyond gender, obviously it's much more common for men to rape women. But if you go beyond gender, actually you get into abuse of power. And the
Mhm.
situation there was an older authority figure where I
Right.
was vulnerable. I'd run away from home. I had nowhere to stay. She said, "You can stay in my house if you cook and clean." I was like, "That's a good deal." And then, of course, being her kind of sex slave was part of the deal also, which I hadn't signed up for. And it ended with her saying, I remember very clearly, "I'm going to the shop to get cigarettes, be out of my house. No, I've got my period, so I'm no longer sexually available. I'm going to the shop to get cigarettes, be out of my house by the time I get back." And that always stayed with me as a kind of, well, there's no doubt here. I was just being used for, a sex slave for that period of time.
Right. So, what do you feel like this does to the soul and the spirit? For some people, it can break them down. Some people never recover from it. Yet, how can somebody also evolve from something like this? What's your take on that?
I mean, what it does to the spirit, the conclusion I came to in asking the question, do all abusers become, all people who have been abused become abusers? I concluded no. I felt it more real that people who've been sexually abused struggle to receive and accept love. And I think the evolution for me, because I'm 57 now, I'm still quite mistrustful. If someone says, "I love you," I think, "What do you want from me?"
Mhm.
Uh, but that's a good challenge because I've had to really look at what does love really mean? What does it mean for me? How do I give and receive love? And that's at the kind of, that's the Beatles were right. All you need is love. That is really at the core of so many things. But if you're blocked there, then you're going to struggle in all aspects of your life. So it's forced me to look with perhaps more acuteness than I would have done if I hadn't had this experience when I was young, which was, that was just one episode. I didn't write about all of my traumatic sexual experiences, but there
Sure.
were others. Yeah.
Yeah. And with the follow-up question, um, with the spirit. So, you being the most dangerous therapist in the world, one of the things that you said, this is kind of like what you apply to your clients. You're like, I'm not necessarily having you come in. You're not going to sit across from me and I'm going to kind of pump you up about your self-esteem and how great you are of a person. I want you to really take a look at the darker aspects so you can begin to heal that and live more freely. So, can you talk a little bit about your approach and why you feel like it's important for people to come to understand their demons?
Mhm.
And, what does that mean?
I think the dangerous thing is kind of tongue in cheek. Someone described me as that affectionately, and I thought, that's good. I'm having that. But I do believe in it. I really do. I mean, I don't believe I'm the most dangerous therapist in the world, but I believe that good therapy should be quite dangerous to your persona.
Mm.
Eckhart Tolle put it very eloquently when he said the biggest obstacle to change that any of us face is our attachment to our persona. It's like, well, but I'm this kind of person. Well, okay, but you just kind of narrowed everything down by saying, I know myself, I'm this kind of person. And I think good therapy or good meditation or good spiritual practice should threaten that sense of self, which is, by my belief system, is always false. I don't think there is such a thing as true self. I think there's essence of self or there's soul, but there's so many layers like Russian dolls of ourselves and so many aspects to our character that you really want to be engaged in dismantling that all the time. So good therapy will be dangerous to the false self, perhaps is the
Right.
truest statement.
Yeah, great way to put it. Yep, absolutely.
And this statement which I encountered very early on in therapy, well, you've just got to love yourself. We're talking about love just now, is true, but it's not complete. I think that a truer statement is you have to love yourself unconditionally, which means you have to have enough self-compassion to be able to ask those questions. So where am I transgressive in my sexuality? And if you don't love yourself, you're not going to want to go in there because it's bad enough already in the day-to-day experience of the self. You have to have a fairly robust level of self-esteem to go, okay, I'm ready now to look at the shittier sides and where I'm not such a nice guy, because I've got enough in reserve to kind of prepare me for what I might find there. And I don't think, I can see out of the corner of my eye, I've scribbled on the wall in the corner of my room a quote by Carl Jung. He said, do you want to be good or whole? I think that's a fantastic question for anyone to ask themselves.
Mm.
Because, who wants to be the bad guy or not a nice guy? But there's no such thing as a nice guy. We're all multifaceted. And if you want to be safe, then know your demons, right? Know what you're capable of. Know your greed, your jealousy, your anger, your rage, your violence. It doesn't make you a bad person. But if you don't know it, if you deny it, then it's going to creep up on you and take you by surprise, because you won't have any mastery over it. You won't have a sense of how to manage that darker side of yourself. And also, most people working with a shadow will agree on this one, that it's not just the malevolent or the unpleasant sides of ourselves that get buried in the shadow. It's also our brilliance. And one thing I will really say I love about America and American culture is the whole American dream, and this idea that anyone can be successful, because in the UK, that's a rather vulgar idea. To be successful is something you keep quiet. You don't celebrate. You shouldn't really, it's considered vulgar to have, or ostentatious to have displays of success or wealth or anything like that. And I think that's kind of messed up, because it keeps people very small here. And the American, in the UK, we will often look at Americans as brash or boastful, but I think it's a much healthier attitude to be celebratory about our success. If not, that gets buried in the shadow as well. And all your brilliance and all your genius and all your potential and all the good shit you've got to offer the world gets hidden away and denied, just as much as your violence or your murderous side or your lustful side. So I think
Right.
that's a really important thing for people to know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as you begin to learn your shadow side, taking a look at that stuff, as you were talking about love and unconditional love, I would say the next step probably too is to love, to be whole is to also love all those aspects within you, because the awareness, like you said, also um, is what can either stop a compulsion or, make you really realize what you could truly be capable of, right? Because everyone is capable of murder.
Yeah.
Everyone is, capable of a lot of things that appear to be the dark side of life. But if you can also acknowledge that and love that about yourself, that's where I think that wholeness comes in. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think probably the single most important thing I ever learned was a quote attributed to the Buddha where he said, "Love yourself and watch." And I think that's the best kind of methodology for living life, is to have that baseline of self-compassion and then just observe and go, that's interesting. I just behaved in a really shitty way to my partner, or I snapped at my kids, or I lost my shit in traffic. What was going on? Rather than, oh God, I did that thing. I'm such a bad person. That takes you nowhere. There's no growth or evolution. You just go straight into bad guy territory, right? Or you deny it and go, it's the other person's fault. There's two places you can really go with that system. But if you just observe with curiosity, it's like, so what was going on? Yeah, I had a bad night's sleep and I hadn't eaten breakfast and I was in a hurry and I wasn't centered, and that's probably not the best way to drive to work. Then you begin to open up options rather than just condemnation and judgment, which is, it's useless.
Right. So it's like, as we talk about it, it sounds so easy. But then, like, as you shared, it's like, here you are, 57, right? You've kind of come to terms with some of the sexual abuse, yet you also recognize and notice within yourself that sometimes there's a little bit of that blockage of love, of self-love, or to be able to receive love, that you can still be very cautious and curious about other people's motives. So why does it seem so hard once we do have this awareness, right? It's like you have the intellectual awareness, it's like you can refer back to these quotes. It sounds like you've done quite a bit of, work on yourself, yet there's still this protective factor that almost is like, it feels like a little bit of a battle of why can't we just step over this threshold and really embody that, of what the Buddha says, and really just embody this own unconditional love within ourselves.
And I hope it is possible. I haven't quit yet. I'm hoping I got a while longer to work at this, but I don't believe there's a completion point. I'm not a huge fan of even phrases like change or healing. I think change happens, but it's usually not in the way that people expect. So yeah, I've been in therapy for 30 years or something, and I've been practicing for most of that. I live this. Does it mean that those defense mechanisms die completely? No, what it means is I don't believe in them anymore. So when I feel myself pulling back from my partner, I have other language. Either internally, I can say, oh, I'm doing that thing again, and it's unnecessary, it's out of date.
Mhm.
Or I can say to her, that's enough. I can't actually handle any more contact right now. It's too much for me. I'm just not available. And that kind of informs her. Will I ever get to a point where I can just bask in someone else's love and affection without having that response? I don't know. Ask me in 30 years' time.
Yeah, but I like what you said, and it's probably important for people to hear is that, healing kind of, as I'm kind of thinking out loud here, as you're kind of triggering things in my mind, healing almost sounds like there's an end point.
Yeah.
But I love the word that you use, a continuum. It's always a continuum. And that maybe sometimes with all these self-help books, and the culture, it's like heal yourself, like everyone's probably anticipating, well, is this the right pill? Is this the right book? Is this finally going to be it that gets me to a point where I'm finally healed? But I think embracing that word continuum of the journey and just understanding that maybe there truly isn't an end point, or, is there supposed to be? Because if there's that end point, then maybe we're fully evolved. But it just seems like we can constantly be evolving. So I love that word continuum.
Yeah. Osho said, where there's certainty, there's no learning. So I think when you get to that place where you go, I know myself, you've stopped growing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know myself. I'm constantly being surprised by myself, constantly finding new doors that, to cupboards I've never opened or never looked in, or other, things that I've explored for decades that I suddenly look at in a slightly different way. So
Yeah.
there is, if there was an end point, I don't think I'd do this. I have I've got attention deficit disorder. If you sign up to that model, which I don't really, I'd have lost interest years ago. But as part of what keeps me engaged in working on myself and working with other people is it's endless. It's not like you're watching the same play over and over again. It's a whole new chapter every single time, and there's constant surprises and things that intrigue me.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved, and I've, heard other people talk about it before, is where you mentioned in your book that true transformation is really death and rebirth, and death and rebirth, and death and rebirth, and death and rebirth, And it's so funny because this week I was talking to a client of mine just of that. It was a client that had survived cancer, and now there's something going on through a divorce and some stuff. And it's as if, pointing out to her that you've died many times in this lifetime, but you've also become reborn, And I think being able to recognize these things that we go through in our life, that we go through many deaths while we're alive and many rebirths. And I couldn't agree with you more that that's really where true transformation comes from.
Mm.
And we were talking, this woman is a little bit older than I am. And we were, I was kind of saying, as you get a little bit older, though, it feels like there's a little bit of wisdom to know, okay, I've gotten through some of this stuff before, I'll be okay this time. And I don't know if you found that too. Within age, there is a little more of this wisdom where you don't get quite as freaked out when kind of shit hits the fan. It's like, okay, I've been here before. I've gotten through some really tough things in life. And I kind of feel as I move through in age, I do look at it more as like a little bit of a challenge, or, okay, what is here for me to learn, rather than going into a crisis mode or, automatic fight or flight. There's a little bit of wisdom there of, okay, there will be a gift. There will be some sort of transformation.
Yeah. I mean, I can still lose my shit completely, but with that kind of, you could call it wisdom or just experience, but in a different way where I know this isn't going to be permanent. Like when I first started to unravel in my late 20s, that was terrifying because I thought, is this it? Is this how it's going to be forever? Am I going to be in a state of fight or flight or panic forever? Now I'm old enough to know. So, okay, Mercury's in retrograde or whatever's going on. It's not going to last forever. I just got to ride this one out. And I have that stamina, I think. Stamina is probably the word. More than wisdom. It's just I know knuckle down and get through.
Right. All right. Let me go through some of my other questions here. Okay. I'm curious to know a little bit about your experiences with psychedelics. So I know that, you went through your own addiction therapy. There was a quote in here too that I wanted you to explain a little bit more because I thought it was interesting. You said, there's this obsessive compulsive drive that unites all addicts. It's too valuable, too powerful. Um, so I know I have kind of like three questions in here, but maybe can we talk a little bit about your journey through addiction and recovery? And what do you mean about that obsessive compulsive drive that unites all addicts?
It's an obsessive compulsive behavior. When I was an addict, I would be constantly thinking about, okay, how much have I got left? I mean, my main addiction was cannabis in those days and prescription downers. But it was a constant, how much have I got left? How long is it going to last me? This was pre-internet days. So, pre-dark web. So it was like, right, I've got to get on the phone, find out who's holding. Then I've got to get in my car, got to get across town, make sure there's a kind of overlap in supply so I don't have any time, where I have to be out. It's a very driven, obsessive thing. People think of addicts as losers and fuck ups and people who aren't together. It's a pretty, demanding lifestyle where you have to have your shit together really to be able to function. Of course, there are plenty of, people who don't manage to hold that together, but I think there's a commonality. You talk to most addicts, they have that kind of narrow focus of, I've just got to score. Anyone who's been addicted to their phone, what an obsessive thing that is, or cigarettes. I've been addicted to cigarettes a lot of my life, and it doesn't matter how cold and wet it is outside. If I'm hooked on cigarettes, I'm going up to the store to buy some tobacco, and that's an obsession. It's a driven, kind of hungry obsession. I'm not so sure, but people have the right to their own kind of modalities with addiction. I'm not sure if I consider it a disease. I don't know I think it's pain management. Is that a disease? Whatever, maybe. Is it something that I've recovered from? No, because on the whole, it's something I've recovered from in that I don't think I'm being destructive. I don't think I'm harming other people. I don't think I'm compromising my life. But I still have that drivenness, and you need that obsessive, compulsive drivenness to write a book. You need it to paint a picture. You need it to make a movie. That obsession with detail. To edit a podcast. All these things require a degree of single-minded attention, and I think that's the flip side of addiction. It's the positive side. So I kind of harness that part of me rather than trying to, good luck with getting rid of it. Like I said, I don't know if that's possible, but I'm not a drug addict. I can be around drugs, narcotics, and that's just not an issue for me. I don't feel that I'm using willpower or self-control. I feel that I dealt with a lot of the pain that I was numbing out. And so that's not something that needs discipline, but I don't want to let go of the whole thing because that drivenness is a fantastic force.
Right.
But these are good questions.
Yeah.
They're great questions I've been asked by therapists in the past. I'm not by no means bipolar, but I'm on that kind of scale of I have very up times and very down time. I'm dyslexic and, I've got different learning difficulties. But when I've ever been asked, so if you could be cured of this, but you'd have to give up the good stuff that comes with it, would you? It's like, there's no way. That manic depressive thing, the depressive thing takes me into dark places where I really look at myself. And then the manic thing means I can write a book in 3 weeks.
Right.
Why would I give that up?
Yeah, awesome. Agree. So with some of your experience with psychedelics, I had never heard of iboga before. I've heard of ayahuasca. I've had quite a few people on the podcast that journey with people. They take people to Peru. They are in contact with these certain shamans, and I have heard about DMT. So instead of going into like each experience, because that's what you do in the book, and we want people to go out and get your book, Empathy for the Devil, do you want to talk just maybe about the overarching arching experience of what these psychedelics kind of did for you, maybe on the soul level.
I mean, I've had arguments with people, as a former drug user, who've said, well, haven't you just fallen off the wagon? Aren't you just going back to taking drugs? I would say no, in as much as I think these are teachers. I think they're medicines as opposed to narcotics. That's semantics. You don't need to get too hung up on that. But the primary difference, I would say, in my 20s, I was being avoidant with my drug use on the whole. And then in my 50s, since I've been using these different medicines, they're not, you don't avoid anything with them. They're very confrontational. So they are, for me, they're shadow medicines in the, once you make that decision and commit to going into that experience, I think this is why some people have a difficult time. They want, they have curiosity, and that's great, but they don't necessarily like what they're confronted with. And they're very confrontational. I've always felt like I've been taken care of. I've always felt that they're benign medicines, that they're on my side. But yeah, you can't avoid yourself. It's like with therapy, we can all run rings around our shrinks. We can manipulate and we can avoid, and we can go, oh, this is getting a little painful. Let's change the subject. And the therapist's job is to try and, keep an eye on that. But we all know how to manipulate other human beings. But you drink some of these medicines, there's no manipulation. You're not getting off the hook. For the next 4 or 5 hours, you are going to be confronted with this stuff, whether you like it or not. And I think that's, in the right circumstances, with the right guides, with the right support, when you're ready, and preferably never before, I went to those particular medicines when I was 50. I'd done over 20 years of therapy, and I realized there were certain blocks places I couldn't access in talking therapy. And I'm a talking therapist. I'm a fan. Clearly, I believe in it. And I recognize the limitations. There's pre-verbal stuff that doesn't really work in a talking therapy because you don't have the language for it. There's all sorts of places where we're so wounded, we're so hurt that it's buried in our unconscious. And that can be dangerous because you don't want to take the lid off too abruptly. But like I say, if you're prepared and you're ready and you have kind of the right mindset, then opening those boxes and looking inside can get you through. They talk about ayahuasca in particular as 10 years of therapy in one night, which I would kind of agree with, the caveat that it doesn't mean you do 10 years of therapy. It means you get that download in one night. You still then got to take 10 years to process it. It's not a shortcut, but it will open up a lot of stuff, and that can be good and that can be overwhelming. I mean, it's 6 years since I drank ayahuasca. I'm thinking of maybe going back next year, which scares the crap out of me, but it scares the crap out of my ego anyway. But yeah, that 6 years has been necessary for me. If in my 20s, I'd have probably gone back every week. But I think with maturity, I've learned, to take time to digest an enormous meal is beneficial before you start picking up more food, really allow yourself to process. So I'm definitely pro psychedelic medicine, but with a lot of caution around it. And I'm not an advocate of going all the time. Everyone's got to decide on their own process and their own journey. But
sure,
I don't push people. I guide them gently, and if I think they're ready, then I'll support them. But I won't encourage them to go back in a hurry. It's like, just take time to unwrap this present and really explore it before you go unwrapping another one.
Yeah. Okay, great. So how about, let's talk about Tim Hetherington and Sebastian Younger. So how did you kind of come to have a relationship with these people? And I know that you have some admiration for Tim, and, you put him in the book in a certain chapter, and then I'll share my story with you.
Yeah, I mean, Tim in the book, I never met Tim. He, again, with age, I think I've come to recognize that when I feel a charge, whether it's deep hatred, like your former president, he triggered the shit out of me. and a lot of people.
Oh my God.
Or if I have a huge kind of warm, fuzzy, loving response to someone, it's all projection, right? So I think I was just on holiday. I'm interested in combat photography. I'm interested in photography. So I've been reading Robert Capa's book, and Amazon says if you've read this, you might like this. And there was a book about this guy called Tim Hetherington, and I bought it and I read it, and it just hooked me. And I went and visited his grave when I got back to London. And at first, I thought the book was going to be about Tim as a role model, actually, because I run a lot of men's groups, and it's a struggle, perhaps more now than it has been for a long time, to find good male role models. I think that's a tough one. So when I've asked that question, you just get met with blank stares by a lot of guys, who are the positive male role models. So I was like, okay, I could build a book around this. I could kind of use him and what he stood for and what he was about. And I think, he comes across as someone with a lot of integrity. So I wrote to Sebastian, who I'd admired for a long time, and he was very quick to reply and was very generous in, supporting me in that project, which then I think it evolved into the book that it became much less about Tim. But that was what really drove me initially, inspired me to start writing again. I never plan books. They kind of come to me every 3 or 4 years, and an idea or a feeling will come. But I think, these are guys that I think are in, modern culture, people that I admire. And again, it's back to shadow work and the buried goodness and brilliance in us. When you see someone that you really admire, it's as important as the people you hate to take ownership of that projection. And so, and it's very hard. It's very hard to do that, but to recognize that at least in a dormant form, I have qualities that I want to nurture and grow in myself that I see reflected in Tim Hetherington, his character and his work.
Yeah. So back in 2008, I opened up a wellness center for combat vets. It was a nonprofit with an acupuncturist, and I was doing more energy work and, therapy with them. And I was made aware of the documentary Restrepo, which phenomenal. And Sebastian, Tim, and I think that there were 2 or 3 of the combat vets were doing a premiere and a Q&A in Albany, New York, really close to where I lived. So we had opened up, this nonprofit for the combat vets, and this documentary comes out, and, Tim was there, and, I met him briefly. I mean, we were in each other's presence for about 2.5 hours, and, we talked to him personally and let him know about the work that we were doing. And there was just such a peacefulness about him and kindness. I mean, he's tall and handsome, so there was that. But also just like I just can't explain it. He was just one of those people that, even though I had only spent about 2.5 hours with him, it was so impactful. And when I heard of his death, it was like really shocking. And I don't know if Sebastian talked about it in a podcast or there was a follow-up or something. But, when you watch that documentary Restrepo and you see how they live, what they lived through, I mean, Sebastian and Tim basically were combat vets, even though they were photographers and experienced all the same PTSD. And then, the way that Tim had died, it's like, God, if he survived, where he was, it was Afghanistan, right? They were in the Cornigal Valley. That's what it was. Yep. And interesting too, like you mentioned in your book, that like that year he was kind of feeling like maybe he should begin to get out of this, journalism and stuff. But it was just comforting for me to read that in your book, and having had, it's kind of like the 7 degrees of separation, of having met him and been in his presence. And then that also led me myself to learn more about Sebastian Junger, and, heard a great podcast with him and Joe Rogan about his book Tribe, and you talked about that too. And also talked about really the importance of community. And that was like another message in your book. It's about, it's important to get to know who is around you. It's important to get to know your community, because when we don't hurt humans we love, you had said.
Yeah.
It's like we hurt idiots, jerks, assholes, among other words and superlatives that he used. But we don't hate and kill humans, and if you have that human contact and that tribal mentality that Sebastian Junger kind of talks about in the book. It's a great book. That's another book people should get and listen to. But did you want to say anything kind of about that and what it means to kind of be within community and the importance of loving, humans, so we're not hurting each other?
I'm definitely guilty of romanticizing the past, and I'm sure, it wasn't as rosy as I can imagine. But I think that a lot of the problems I see that I encounter in people when I'm working and that I see politically and socially and, down to climate change and these very, very serious things that we're facing as a species, I would say are not entirely, but largely a product of a lack of community, because you don't burn up a planet that you care about, and I think we've all become very, so we've objectified the planet as much as we've objectified each other. We've become cut off from our nature. We've retreated into cities, and we don't have the same relationship that our ancestors had. And people go, well, that's a really long time ago. It is a long time ago, but it isn't. If we've been around in more or less in this kind of form for 2 million years, and we've been living in cities for about 8,000 years, that's a fraction of time.
Mm-hmm.
That we've been in existence. But I believe it was Sebastian told me that pre-agricultural revolution, which was 8 to 10,000 years ago, there was about 1 million people on the planet. Now there's 7.5 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Facebook and social media and what have you, they're an attempt, they come from our impulse or our instinct to connect with each other, but it's not the same as living in a tribal society or a village society where you know each other. I mean, even I think I put this in the book. Even and my mother's nearly 90, but when she was a child, she lived in a small village. The one that you would see in movies. They film there all the time. It's the kind of archetypal English country village. And she said there was, the butcher and the grocery shop and the post office and the blacksmith's shop and the place where you took your laundry and the pedophile, and everyone knew which was which. And I think that's an amazing statement, that there was an old guy who was allowed to live in the village, who wasn't put in prison, wasn't ostracized, but you just kept your kids away because it wasn't safe. Everyone knew who he was. There's a visibility. Now we have sex offenders programs where people are relocated and given new names when they're released from prison. And it's like, well, you don't know who your neighbor is. And it's no longer safe to let your kids out and play in the street, because our sense of protectiveness of each other and our environment and our planet has collapsed, and we've all become very separate from each other, and we treat each other with suspicion. That's a human tragedy that I think has far-reaching effects. And like I say in the book, you don't abuse, you don't insult, you don't attack, you don't rape, you don't murder people. You do that to objects, to dehumanized people. So the dehumanization that comes with separation, I think is, and that's my definition of toxic, really. That's what toxicity comes from.
Yeah. Right. So I just have to look up one last quote that I got from your book that I really felt like wraps everything up and is a beautiful message. It might be a nice way to kind of take you out to end this great talk that we're having. And I don't remember, it was a little bit further, maybe closer to the end of the book. And you said, take responsibility for your own evolution. You don't have to get spangled on strange jungle medicine, and you don't have to do therapy or go traipsing around old trenches or graveyards, but follow your heart. Let your feelings guide you. Whenever you have an awakening, pursue it, even if you don't know why. It's trying to bring you home. I love that. So maybe take responsibility for your own evolution. Let's just hear one last thought that you have about that, because that was just beautifully written in your book.
Oh, no one's going to do it for you. It comes down to that, doesn't it? I have I'm in my therapy room now where I practice, and on the door on the way in, no one ever sees it because the door's open when they come in. It's my little private joke, really. It says on the back of it says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," which was above the doorway to hell in Dante's Inferno. And I like that, partly because I've got a dark sense of humor, but also because I believe in it. I think most people, maybe everyone, I don't know if this is universal, but most people, when they come into therapy or when they begin this journey, there's still residue of a hope that the therapist will fix you, or there might be a magic pill that your doctor can give you that will make all your pain go away, or you can take plant medicine and everything will be okay, which I think is rooted in a kind of a very primal desire for our parents to be the parents we really wanted, which of course none of them are, because none of them are capable of that, because they're all wounded people. You get some people who get lucky and they've got great relationship with their parents, but our parents are just human beings struggling to do their best. So that residue of hope that someone will save us, God, Jesus, Christianity, religion, there's all sorts of places where we can project that dream or hope that someone's going to save us. My statement, abandon all hope, it's not as pessimistic or as negative as it sounds. It's like, just stop waiting for the cavalry to come, because you will wait a long time and they're not going to show up. Feel sad about that. Go through the grief, because I think there is a grieving process when you realize, oh shit, I've got to do all this by myself. And there's a sadness, and you got to let go. My mom's just not going to be the mom I needed or wanted. My dad's not going to do it either. There's a sadness and a grieving process that people often need to go through. And then you get this incredible power. I would say it's true power, not the power that people can abuse, take advantage of, or go crazy with, but a genuine power and authority that comes with adulthood. And that's the reward for letting go of hope that someone's going to save you, is that you become adult. And you step it, this is, to me, these kind of throwaway meme-like words that we use, like stepping into your power. What does it actually mean? To me, it means growing up. It means being an adult. It means not waiting for the cavalry to come and save me, taking responsibility for my decisions, for how I impact other people, for the dark, shadowy corners in my own soul, being willing to go there. And the reward is to come home to yourself. That's what it really means. And that means being in charge of yourself.
Right.
And being accountable for your impact on the people you love and the world. And we're not doing the best job right now. So
Right.
I think it's more important than ever.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, Jerry Hyde, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation today. Again, the book that we were talking about is called Empathy for the Devil, but you have written other books. So where can people find your books or more information about you? And we'll put those links in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, I always, ask people, go to your local bookstore. Unfortunately, most people say I haven't got a local bookstore because Amazon and, these big companies wiped it out years ago. But if you have local bookstores, then support them by ordering the books through there. And my website is my name, jerryhyde.co.uk.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you were able to take a lot away from this conversation today. Check out the book. It's great. Empathy for the Devil, Jerry Hyde. And I will talk to you guys next time and bring you another phenomenal guest. Thank you, everyone.